Two-Face, Oblivion. Excerpt read by the author. Do we not realize that self-respect comes with self-reliance? Abdul Kalam. Introduction. When Chris Watts left the computer room for lunch, the door banged shut and the law enforcement trio were left to mull, and mull they did. While Watts sat down and picked up his spoon and started munching on macaroni, he had his morning session to contemplate, to himself. Meanwhile, two agents, one from the FBI, Graham Coder, and one from the CBI, Tammy Lee, consulted one another, and with a lead detective from Frederick PD, David Baumhover. During the break, the three got to fine-tune their strategy and improve their respective approaches. They already had 3 hours of audio and some additional insight into the murders. They needed more. Two could advise the third on how each could do whatever they were doing better. All three examined their notes and planned the next session using the first session as guidance. But it wasn't like they were interviewing Hannibal Lecter. It wasn't like Coder, Lee and Baumhover needed to use neurosurgery or advanced psychology to get into Watts's brain. They just had to coax their way in. Be nice to the guy. Don't be too pushy. And one of them could pick up the baton later in the conversation if he dodged something from the other. When Watts returned, belly somewhat full and somewhat satisfied, he was primed and mentally prepared for the next session. But it was still 1 versus 3, and no matter how sneaky Watts was, or how often he tried to feint away from questions, there was always going to be at least 2 fresh minds to take over the lead when the conversation and mental evasion stalled. 3 heads working against the cunning of Chris Watts, or rather 3 crafty minds trained to deal with a criminal mind versus a mind way out of his depth once again, was at least twice as much mental firepower as Watts could muster. And, just like it played out during the first confession back in Frederick, Colorado, if the trio were patient and paced themselves, if they stuck to their respective strategies and played it just right, it would be like taking candy from a baby, wouldn't it? That was Two-Face Oblivion, the 8th book in the Two-Face series. It was published on June 9th, 2019. And at the time it was written, it was meant to be the final book of the series. It was a relatively short book at only 171 pages. In comparison, the first book, which I think is the shortest book thus far, was only 117 pages. I wrote Oblivion after returning from a month-long trip through Europe. I think I returned from that trip on May 28th, and the book came out on June 9th, 2019. I'm going to deal with the writing and researching aspects a little bit later, because I think the output and the methodology and the approach, I think a lot of people are unfamiliar with, and I think a lot of people equate writing fast with rushing and with almost like a slapdash approach, and that your research is going to be inferior and that your work is going to be full of errors. So I want to just address that idea. Oblivion is probably one of the best reviewed books of the series, short as it was. I'm going to read one review posted on amazon.co.uk, just posted on June the 13th, so only 4 days after the book came out. This review was posted. So obviously whoever read it pretty much bought it as soon as it came out, read it immediately. That sort of actually addresses to a large extent the relationship, I guess, between the writer and the reader. Is there are people who are very voracious readers and very interested in research and very interested in information, and they don't want to wait more than a year for a book. They want to get the analysis ASAP, and that's really the service I provide. Now, once again, you can make the claim that the work is just, it's fast but it's foolish, and that's fine. You know, those people don't need to read the books, then that's fine. But there are people who appreciate the speed at which the books are brought out, and they appreciate the quality of the research. I always find it interesting where people say it's badly researched. It makes me wonder, would you be able to tell the difference between good research and bad research? Meaning, if you were sitting in a room with me and we were talking about this case, and you said that fact is wrong, would you be able to prove it? And would you be able to back it up with sort of off the top of your head going into the discovery and all that kind of thing? All I'm saying is, there are a lot of people who have a conception about facts, and it's based on the media, and it's based on reading Reddit, and it's based on watching YouTube videos, and it's not very educated, it's not very informed, not very intelligent. So when people accuse me of bad research, it makes me wonder what their research is. In any event, this is the review posted June 13th. It's titled The Last Book of the Series. I've read all the Two-Face books and almost all of Nick's books. I really enjoy the author's style. Such a gifted writer. Thanks a lot. I've learned so much, not only about the case but about the world. And that's what I love about Nick's writing. Truly highly recommended reading. One thing that I think differentiates my work from, say, a dry analysis or a dry reporting of the case is I, besides the research, besides the intertextual elements that I highlight, besides the psychology, which I think is my strength, and besides the analysis, what I also do is I take kind of a highbrow approach, especially towards the end of the narrative. And what I mean by that is I try to look at some of the issues that are playing out, that are sort of rotating and gyrating as sort of almost like psychological forces and shadows, that are sort of clouding the people involved in this case. And then I try and find the anthropological aspects. I try and find the anthropodicey. I try to anchor the narrative in not just criminal psychology but human society, and in sociology. And that is really always a fascinating debate, because as soon as you do that, you start to see their connections to greater forces that are going on in the world and the world that we recognize. And as soon as you have that conversation, you begin to recognize our own connections and the strings that are tugging at us, negative and destructive and undermining, that are part of our society in the modern world, part of our reality in the modern world. And a lot of these things are unvoiced and unacknowledged and unrealized. And within the context of the crime, when you go deeper and deeper and deeper, you eventually start to not only recognize them, but you're able to kind of define them specifically and say, this is what's going on. And then, within the schema of the case, you start to trace these patterns and these forces, if you will, and then you realize these same forces are operating in your life, and how are you responding to them? Right? And so it actually helps make us a lot more conscious. Now, no, even just having this conversation just sounds very highbrow, and what's it got to do with Chris Watts? But that's sort of the end game in, when you write a series of 8 books, you want it to go somewhere eventually. You want to take the why and address it in a more human way, if I can put it that way. So you take the aspects that are in this case, and then you apply it to the the greater scenario that we all faced with, living in a world that's got a lot of social media. How did this family deal with social media? Dealing with debt, how did this family deal with debt? How do we deal with debt? How do couples who cheat on each other deal with that in terms of their communication? Messaging one another. Isn't there another way of dealing with it? Isn't there a better way of dealing with it? All of these things, and one can address that, in terms of, how should one properly get a divorce? How should one properly raise one's children? If one's not getting along with one's spouse, how does one properly communicate it? And so on and so on and so on. So there really is a lot of value in these stories if we prepare to take it that far. And I know a lot of people aren't. I know some people are only reading these books just to get the analysis and almost to get to the gory details, just to get to, because in almost all the books I write, I do revisualize aspects of the crime scene, and I know a lot of people just buy the book and they just sort of scroll right to there, and they sort of get, so that's where his research has dealt with the but it's a little bit like let's say Game of Thrones, going right to the last episode and going to the last 5 minutes of it. You maybe are getting the ultimate conclusion, but you lose a hell of a lot by doing that. You lose the insight and the it's a painful process, it's a long process, and one's got to pay a price to get these insights. And so even if the reader wants to sort of scroll, a reader is totally entitled to pick and choose what they want to read, but I'm just saying, doing that, you deprive yourself really of that whole experience of learning how to think about some of these cases, and learning how to apply some of these hard-won insights, right? So yeah, if we come back to the book, Oblivion was a lot like the last book in the Jodi Arias series. That was also a series of 6 books. It was, I think, originally going to be 3 books, but there was then that's the sentencing hearing, and Oblivion felt a lot like Obscurity, and there's something about writing numerous narratives like this that allows one to really get to know someone inside and out, and that's another aspect. You know, the writer needs a lot of time to get to know these people inside and out. The writer needs a lot of you're not just going to get that from research, you're going to get that from listening to an interview, listening to it again, and transcribing it, and then realizing it's an interesting thing when you transcribe. Sometimes when you transcribe, you will write something, but it's not, you're hearing it, but it's actually not what he's saying. And one's got to be very careful with that, where you are hearing what you, I guess, want to hear and not what he's actually saying. And the amazing thing when you write is you have to slow down all of that analysis. So someone who's a YouTuber who's analyzing something, they don't need to sort of transcribe it, so they will just give it a very light-hearted touch. When you write it down, you pick up a heck of a lot of details, not just in semantics, but in the tone that they conveyed in, and in the little idiosyncrasies. And what is really amazing is you can watch a interview or a video and pay really careful attention to it, and you might say, yeah, I think I know what happened there. And you'll find when you're transcribing it, maybe when you know, sometimes you go back further than you meant to, just to get to the point that you last reached in your transcription, and so you almost inadvertently play back sections that you don't necessarily want to hear again, but you end up hearing these things again and again and again, and sometimes through that you accidentally come across little details, and these details then add up, and it's something you weren't looking for, and it's something you weren't aware of, and they sort of sneak up on you, and then you realize, wow, this is pretty incredible. So you know, by the time that I got to the 8th book, you really get to know Chris Watts really well, and you get to start repeatedly using certain phrases that describe him. I know in Obscurity, I mean long before I got to Obscurity, but on the way to Obscurity, writing about Jodi Arias, I thought of her as a chameleon. I thought of her as someone who was very good at sort of changing her colors to suit different people and different settings, you know, whether it was in the courtroom or as a waitress or as the wannabe girlfriend of Travis Alexander or whatever. Jodi could sort of change herself, right? And I think that's just part of her problem, was that she didn't really have her own identity, and that kind of made her vulnerable to being used. And again, I get that people would say, well, they hate Jodi Arias, they don't really want to know what her point of view is. But to understand the crime, you had to sort of see the fact that by being this sneaky, sly, slithery chameleon that was so effective at changing herself, she also lost herself. And so when Travis sort of kicked her to the curb, it felt a lot more like she was being rendered into a nothing, rendered invisible, than I think a lot of people realize. So what I'm getting at is, normally when someone breaks up with you, you don't, you know, you move on with your life. But if you've been spending your whole life turning yourself inside out to be acceptable to other people, then when you've committed enough to one particular person and that happens, it can be horrifying and horrific and a horrible experience. And that, I think, was the obscurity that Jodi Arias was faced with when Travis broke up with her. And so the thing that she was totally it was her biggest fear came true. She lost everything and she's in jail living out a life sentence. And the same thing applies to Chris Watts. He's also facing Oblivion. It's a little bit different. I don't see Chris Watts as a chameleon in the way that Jodi Arias was. It's a little bit different, and which is why I've described him as a silver fox. He's a crafty guy, but unlike Jodi Arias, he's not a... Jodi Arias was quite extroverted and sort of over the top and crazy in a way, just really crazy, whereas Chris Watts is far more reserved, introverted, careful. And if you compare the murders, Jodi Arias' murder was sadistic and over the top and very personal, whereas Chris Watts's crime, as horrific as it wasn't nearly as sadistic as Jodi Arias's, and it didn't have the hallmarks of an emotional crime in the way that did, and that's why I describe him as a silver fox, more as a crafty character, as a quiet character, sort of slinking around, and you never quite know what the hell is going on with him. But the amazing thing is when you don't just write one book, but you write several, and when you covering a case for as long as we have, through True Crime Rocket Science, regular blogs, catching every single news story. And how I do that is I have the words Chris Watts as a Google alert, so whenever anyone sort of talks about him, not anyone, but when he appears in the media, then I get an alert, and so I don't miss anything. And this is why I found the sort of embargo on this book that's come out on Chris Watts weird. There were just no alerts during that time, and the couple that there were from sort of the Daily Mail. And I've actually seen my books shoot up in terms of sales, especially with British readers, because the British readers seem to have now realized there's the Chris Watts case is out there. So yeah, it's just interesting that's been the case. So in any event, the situation with Chris Watts right now, where he is in jail and is in is in the process of living out a life sentence behind bars. How does one deal with the claustrophobia of incarceration? How does one deal with the reality of a life sentence? And we know a little bit from what's been revealed in the third confession that how he deals with it is he has hope. He is thinking about how other countries deal with life sentences, and he's thinking about how maybe this or maybe that. I don't think it's very realistic, but I also think it's very human. I think it's very human, even when you're in a situation where there's no hope, to have hope. And I think that also speaks a little bit about the circumstances of this crime, is that he was in a hopeless situation from his own perspective, but he had hope. I'm talking about in terms of the crime. He had hope that if he did X, Y, and Z, maybe there was a chance that something could happen. And no one is saying it's a realistic hope, but that same psychology is applicable to where he is now in jail. He's in Oblivion, and yet I'm sure he has hope that there's a way to get out of it. Now, bear in mind it's early days. It's even early days for Jodi Arias. So, even with Jodi Arias, she is hopeful that she can have another trial and another bite at the cherry. If Juan Martinez, the prosecutor, gets sort of his impact on her trial gets sort of invalidated, and that would then allow her another chance to defend herself or something like that, have an appeal. I don't think she has a hope, but she is nevertheless hoping that there's some way that she can get out of jail eventually. But the point is, it's still early days. She hasn't been in jail very long, and this is that early struggle, almost like a fetus in the womb struggling to be born and struggling to get out. That's sort of what's happening with Jodi Arias. And Chris Watts is even earlier into that game. He's even earlier into that very first period where you wake up and you're in jail, and the next day you're in jail, and the next day. And how do you deal with that's now your reality? And when you look at the first, second, third confessions, you can see that he's very good at making up his own reality, and that's what he's doing in jail. The problem is, as much as he makes up reality, those walls don't change. He still wakes up the next day and he's still behind them. He's still behind bars. And so this is the point of the whole idea of oblivion and the whole idea of obscurity, is that whatever this reality these deviants are making up, you have this sort of slow creep of death and of sort of whatever the notoriety that was achieved by this crime, whatever the significance they achieved through their dastardly deeds, there's the slow creep of insignificance and obscurity and oblivion, and how they're going to deal with that. And this is where we come back to where I say you deal with this in a sort of anthropological way and a sociological way. As you say, this is their situation, and we can look in it almost with satisfaction, and even almost like a sadistic satisfaction, and say, well, and rub your hands and say, I'm so glad they got what they deserved, and rot in jail, and I hope something happens to you in jail, whatever. But there's another way of looking at that, and the way of looking at that is these are individuals, and maybe they are paying exactly the right price for their crimes. You can make the argument that they should be paying more, whatever it is, but for the sake of argument, let's say they are exactly where they need to be, and they're exactly what's happening is exactly appropriate or adequate. And then you look at that from the perspective where you say, how does that apply otherwise? In other words, what if you haven't committed a crime? Or what if you've done something that you're also in a situation of obscurity? You're also in a prison of oblivion, and maybe it's your fault, maybe you were in a marriage and you did something, but you or someone are in a situation that's the same. You're in a jail that you deserve to be in, or you're in a prison that someone else put you in and you didn't want to be in it. Whatever the situation is, how does one deal with that? And then you say, well, maybe hope is the answer, and another possibility is maybe changing your reality is the answer. And then the point is, that's just a really interesting conversation to have, to think about how does their oblivion and their obscurity, how does that reflect on us in our lives? Because no matter how you slice it, whether Chris Watts is in jail or Jodi Arias is in jail, we are sitting here from the outside looking in and saying whatever we're saying, but aren't we in jails of our own kind? The fact that we're interested and even obsessed and sort of daily just looking at these criminals, what are we getting away from? What sort of oblivion are we trying to sort of sidestep ourselves? So there's some kind of slow creep that's applying as well, and it's difficult to just look in the mirror and say, this is what's going on in my life. But it's less difficult when you studying the life of another person, and then you start to appreciate the complexities in their life, as despicable as they may be, but noticing that there's certain things that they are dealing with, even in a bad way, in a maladaptive way. And then one looks at that and you can say, am I dealing with it better? I'm not a criminal, but I may be in a situation of obscurity. Am I dealing with it any better? And I can tell you kind of in a forthright way, I'm an author. I write a lot of books. I spend a lot of time writing and researching. As much as people might say, who don't know me or don't know my work, might say, wow, your work's shabby, the research is second rate, it's not even accurate. That sort of is a kind of obscurity I've got to deal with, because I don't have the fact that I've appeared on CNN behind me to sort of give me credibility. I'd like to say yet, but I don't know if it's going to happen anytime soon. I recently contacted a journalist and I got this sneering attitude, and so that's my obscurity, and I've got to sort of deal with that. And I like to think that my work speaks for itself, but it doesn't quite do that. It doesn't quite. I can't sort of just rely on the work to just speak for itself, even though it does. I've also got to promote the work and that kind of thing. So that's that's the situation of, in a way, everybody. Every living creature, every organism comes out of obscurity, and no matter what we do and how fantastically effective we are in our lives, we revert to obscurity. We die. We we grow old if we're lucky, and we then just become no matter what heights we achieve, we become obscure again. So obscurity is something we're going to need to deal with, whether we like it or not, and also whether we sort of break through and get what we want and live the fairy tale or not. Something we're going to have to learn to deal with. So this is why I used that quote at the beginning. Do we not realize that self-respect comes with self-reliance, from Abdul Kalam? Now, this is such a powerful and truism. I think the temptation when you're feeling sort of overwhelmed by obscurity and insignificance and the creep of reality, or whatever you want to call it, is that the way to fix it is to kind of get more attention and to get more influence from the outside world and whatever it is, but it's not. We don't get that respect from the outside first. It needs to come from the inside first. And that's why I'm kind of in a place where, as much as I care about reviews and I care about people who criticize me, fortunately I've got that resilience, and I've done enough work where I've been just impressed by what I've discovered. Not all on my own strength. I mean, I've piggybacked and I've stood on the shoulders of giants in terms of the highbrow stuff, and it's really been amazing to see how their insight applies to true crime. And but the bottom line with all of that comes back to this idea that self-respect is about self-reliance. So for me, the fact that my books employ me, that enough people buy my books, that I'm able to be self-employed and live on my own terms, and it's not. It used to be a struggle. It's not a struggle anymore. That is a validating place to be, and so my self-respect comes out of that self-reliance. Now, if you apply that to both Jodi Arias and Chris Watts, you say, how self-reliant were they? Right? If you take the obscurity and the oblivion aspect and you say, were you self-reliant enough that you could get yourself out of your oblivion and your obscurity and your dysfunctional situation? And the answer is no. Jodi Arias kind of couldn't look after herself. She was struggling to emerge into the world, so she wasn't very self-reliant, right? And she was trying to almost get that reliance, get that independence, or whatever you want to call it, get that ticket out of her scenario, out of her situation, through another person, through someone who had, a nice home and lots of friends and money and influence and whatever it is. So she was trying to get her self-reliance from somebody else, and that's not how you get it. The same with Chris Watts. He was actually trying to get his self-reliance through Kissinger, who was a very self-reliant person, a very independent kind of person. I'm very dismayed by the constant sort of stuck record where people just keep using slurs on Nicole Kissinger all the time. You don't have to like Nicole Kissinger, and you certainly don't have to approve of what she did, and you certainly don't have to kind of give her a clean slate in terms of cheating on someone or whatever it is. But that's not the full picture of Nicole Kissinger. It's just like a little aspect of it, and it's certainly the aspect that applies chiefly to the Chris Watts case. But what about the other aspects? What about, what was her education? What were her dreams, and what was her sort of attitude to health and to money, and what was her financial situation, all that kind of thing. And people aren't interested in that discussion, but then you shouldn't be here. You shouldn't be. They're not about true crime. It's about, I want to feel good about hating someone, and I want to, maybe someone cheated on me, and I want to hate on that person so that I can get psychological strength from doing that. That's not true crime. That is just drama and soap opera and ego. That's got nothing to do with this. As soon as you have the courage to start having these conversations without judgment, where you try and look at these people as people and not have some kind of, like when you buy a steak and a little flag on it that says medium rare or well done or whatever, that little flag defines that steak, but it's not really the steak. I mean, you can't eat that flag, right? Now the same applies to Nicole Kissinger. You can't say that the flag of her is who she is, but a lot of people are very happy with that. But as soon as you take it a bit further, then you say, what about Nicole Kissinger's self-reliance? Was she emotionally self-reliant? Why did she need Chris Watts? Was she in love with the idea of a fairy tale? Did she want did she want to be married? And did she need his, the almost impression she had of his self-reliance? Is that what she wanted? In other words, she was a self-reliant person in almost every respect, in terms of her job and her money and whatever. But in terms of romance and the opposite sex, maybe she wasn't. So I'm just saying this whole idea of it becomes very, very interesting. And that if you're reading this as a reader and you're not a criminal and you want to improve your life and you are concerned about oblivion in your life and obscurity in your life and whatever, then this is the recipe to address that, which is you need to build your self-respect. And how do you do that? Become more self-reliant. How do you become more self-reliant? Well, you can answer that. Maybe it's being more financially independent. Maybe it's being more emotionally independent. Maybe it's being more sort of, if there are toxic people in your life, get rid of them. If you're a toxic person, why are you? Start building relationships with your world. And by that I don't mean with other people necessarily, but with where you are. Start building real connections, not through the internet, but real connections with where you are, whether it's planting a garden or, going out and exercising in your surroundings, or, caring about how the climate's impacting your little community or your little world, all those sort of things. But be connected to where you are and be self-reliant where you are, and out of that will come strength and self-respect. And from there you can, build on your relationships with others, not from the outside in, but from the inside out. So, by the time we got to the 8th book, we were also dealing with the invalidity of the whole narcissism narrative. I'm also shocked and disappointed whenever I see the word narcissism. It's totally not applicable to this case. And so when I see a comment and someone's talking about narcissism, I basically know I'm dealing with a sort of, or it's almost like a newbie, someone that's either totally uneducated about this crime or totally sort of indoctrinated. So in other words, they don't have any true crime rocket science, and they probably should just be shown out the door, like go back to wherever it is you came from and go and talk about narcissism, and I do wonder, the people who are talking about narcissism all the time, are you a self-reliant person? Do you have good self-respect? Why are you pointing the finger of narcissism to other people? Why is this word narcissism so important to you? I saw a comment recently where someone said, well, you're using this word introversion instead of narcissism, but that's also a label, and that accounts for 1 billion people. I'm not going to address that except to say introversion is the better explanation for Chris Watts, but it's also a kind of oblivion. It's also a kind of obscurity. This idea that you introverted, so you sort of cut out of the world, but it's by your own doing. You've purposefully limited your exposure to the world, but at the same time you in control. You want to decide how much exposure you have. And so in terms of the introvert thing, Chris Watts, I think, wanted less obscurity for himself than what he had in his marriage, and so he wanted to reach out, but still within the guise of the introvert, and have this other life. And he wanted, a big part of what he did was that he wanted to be more self-reliant. He didn't want to give up his independence, his money, his house to someone else, someone that he had come to dislike and maybe even hate, right? He wanted to be self-reliant. And although that idea is good and right and appropriate and adaptive, how we applied it obviously wasn't. And it wasn't very respectable, and it wasn't right? But the idea of wanting to be self-reliant certainly is important, right? So I'm just going to spend a short couple of minutes just talking about the writing behind these books. The idea that you write a book quickly isn't really new. Stephen King in On Writing talks about writing a draft over the period of a month, but no longer than 3 months. So even Stephen King, who's a traditional writer in terms of being published through the traditional book publishing, paper book publishing medium, which is slow, sort of imagines that you shouldn't take longer than 3 months to write a draft. And to some people that might be surprising. Wow, 3 months to write a fiction book. That's not a really long time. He's saying not longer than 3. So in other words, it could be shorter. It could be 1 month. There's an article in Publishers Weekly that talks about this new wave of self-publishing, which has partly been made possible by Amazon and also by the whole, the technology that comes with it. Not just the Kindle, but the fact that you can download a book instead of, going out to a store. The fact that if you have the book, you can search through the book, and there are all sorts of little things that you can do. But the big advantage with Kindle is, for someone like me, is that you can write the book, edit it, and you don't have this long waiting period with the publisher. I think this last book that's just come out, the author said that the book spent a month at editing, right? A month. And people have talked about there being still errors and typos. I'm not sure if that's true, but if it is, it just shows you even a month of editing doesn't necessarily catch everything. I've had a book published with a proper book publisher, and my book was in like a kind of hiatus for eventually 2 years. I mean, it took 2 years to get the book from written to published, and that just kind of convinced me that I never wanted to do that again. So the writer that is quoted in Publishers Weekly self-publishes an average of 5 books a year, and is very respectable. But I mean, that's almost a book every 2 months, right? In comparison, I've written 93 books. I've been writing sort of very actively, books I'm talking about, very actively for the past 5 years, so not a really long time. I'm aiming to get to the 100 milestone by May or June 2020. And if you do the math, 100 books in 5 years averages 20 books a year per year over 5 years. 20 books a year is almost 2 books a month, which is basically a book every 2 weeks. A book every 2 weeks. So I don't do that anymore. At the moment, my output has gone down to less than half of that, which is around about 1 book a month, or just over a month. Now, it doesn't take me a month to write the book. It takes me around about 10 days to 2 weeks to write a book, and then a few days editing, which I also do with other people. I send the book to other readers and they give me feedback, and I also edit. It is very quick, but like I say, my output has slowed, and I'm intending to slow down even more. Once I get to 100, I want to actually stop writing for a while. If I write 1 book every 3 months or 1 every 6 months, that will be fine for me. Now, I realize that's not going to be good news for the people who sort of turn to me when the next high-profile crime comes out, or there are a lot of people that are still waiting for the next book in the Treachery series. I was actually working on the 3rd book in the Treachery series, which deals with Casey Anthony when the Chris Watts case sort of happened. And I get a lot of questions, when's the next book coming out? I get the same with Scott Peterson, when's the 4th book, Weight of the World, coming out? I've been getting the same thing with Rebecca Zahau, when's the 2nd book coming out? Then I wrote it, and then now when's the 3rd book coming out? So you keep getting that. And I've been responding, but that's probably gonna stop certainly for a while. I might be sort of very current again, maybe 2021 or whenever. But I certainly want to take the foot off the gas for a while. I feel like I've really done what I wanted to do with the Chris Watts case, which is interrogate a case while it is happening, and in the absence kind of a court case, and then say, well, what value did that have? Got a hell of a lot of criticism from people saying, how can you bring a book out without X, Y, and Z? And I think I have proved that even in the very first book I was talking about using chemicals for sedation, and that's now been corroborated or certainly referenced more than a year later. So there was definitely insight in the very first book. But what I think is the real sort of interesting journey is the people who read the books as they came out, and read the blogs as well, and so those people really enjoyed a very rich journey of revelation and insight, and discovering so much more than we would have if we just didn't really pay that much attention to the case, right? Some people who've maybe read the recent books will get a little bit of that in Silver Fox when that comes out in a couple of weeks. Silver Fox is basically a response to the latest sort of cacophony of speculation surrounding Chris Watts. So that's a book that's coming out very quickly in response to all this conjecture, and it's kind of trying to get the narrative back on track to say, this is the true crime rocket science assessment of this new information. This is what we already know. This is what changes, and etc., etc., etc. And so people who've read all the books will, I think, there are a lot of people who can't wait for the next book to come out. But what I'm trying to say is that sort of reflexive, adaptive narration is unfortunately going to be coming to an end. It's just very difficult to put everything aside and be that available and provide that kind of really fast, really quality analysis. You've got to be almost put everything aside and just focus on the case, and it comes at a high price. So writing 2 books a month as I was at one stage, that's a lot of writing. But with it has come expertise and comfort within this genre. And I think the ability to think very effectively, especially intertextually. John Douglas is someone else who's associated with that, with profiling someone, usually a serial killer, and then comparing that to other criminals. I'm doing that, but in a way that's a little bit different to John Douglas. I think there's been the perception that you can only profile, for example, a serial killer basically a serial killer, but that's not true. You can profile an ordinary criminal, and you do that through their identity. It's not just a psychological profile. One can also look at their identity and quite a lot of other aspects. And one's not saying that, for example, if you compare Jodi, Arias and Chris Watts, one's not saying they're the same animal, but one is certainly saying there are very distinct patterns that are similar, right? Which is why I say, as similar as they are in their mendacity, I mean, these are 2 spectacular liars, and not even good liars, right? When you look at them, they're not the same animal. The one's a chameleon, the other one's a silver fox. The one is an extrovert, but they do have this aspect, these aspects that they do have in common. So, I used to hold John Douglas in really high regard, especially when I watched Silence of the Lambs way back in the 90s. There was a time when I thought of him as a legend. I thought, wow, this guy is brilliant. But after doing a lot of my own research, doing a lot of my own work, I think of John Douglas as quite ordinary, especially for his assessment on the Ramseys, West Memphis 3, and especially Amanda Knox. So that's been quite interesting. This whole idea of profiling, and I think where I surprised myself in terms of the power of it was when I wrote Slaughter, which I still think is one of my best books and my most insightful books, one of the hardest books to write and one of the longest books I've ever written. That book, and also Incel, Cause and Effect, both those books, I think that was when I realized you can really take the profiling thing to mass shooters, and in that sense you can actually, in a way, you can identify these people before these crimes happen. It's not that hard to do, but I think there's a case to be made that by profiling certain disenfranchised people before they commit a crime, by literally identifying them, you can almost also create a self-fulfilling prophecy. And this may be why the FBI aren't sort of explicit about that. They may do it, but I don't think they want the public to do that, because to do that might literally bring it about. I'm not sure if I agree with that, but there it is. Yeah, just to come back to the writing, I've decreased output significantly this year in 2019 to do a couple of things that are kind of new. I've done quite a lot of blogging, but I've also sort of reached a point where I sort of feel that there's no point in blogging every day sort of into infinity. You cover what there is to cover, and then when you feel like it's done, then you draw a line. And the only reason I've sort of continued blogging again not every day, but just coming back to it, is when it feels like there's narratives to counter, and there's information that needs to be communicated. So 2019 was definitely a different kettle of fish, and I do feel like the Crime Rocket blog provided a sort of handshake between me and a lot of the American public, where they got to know me simply through Googling Chris Watts, and they got to know, like if you say that my research or the research of True Crime Rocket Science is poor, or that the writing is full of typos, I think you can just go to the blog and you can see the average level of quality and the average level of insight and the average level of sort of coverage. It sort of covers everything. The whole idea is that you don't miss anything and that you cover it from every conceivable angle. And what I've found quite interesting is you look at some of the YouTubers covering this trial, and they sort of run out of ideas. And I haven't even begun to sort of go through the blogs and sort of regurgitate what was done in them. I mean, one aspect that I want to highlight is the true financial situation of the Watts family. I wrote quite a few blogs on that, and that hasn't really been addressed on by the YouTubers. That aspect, it's not very well known, but that doesn't mean it's unknowable. So yeah, even lately the YouTube videos have also been taking quite a lot of my time. To be honest, I would be writing now on Silver Fox if I wasn't recording this right now. So you should bear that in mind. Is every blog I write, every YouTube video I make is time I would otherwise be literally writing narratives. And to be honest, I do often find that I'm putting up content for free. A lot of it is to introduce my work ethic and to to share my insights for what they're worth. But it is quite a lot of time that is spent giving away free content, right? And to be honest, I would rather be spending that time writing books that people buy. I would rather be doing that. The way that I justify it is I just say, well, I'm not doing this forever. I'm not going to be blogging at the rate that I've been all the time every year. The Chris Watts case was definitely a episode, if I can put it that way. And this YouTube coverage I'm providing now isn't going to be consistent either. I anticipate by the end of this month There are not going to be a lot of YouTube videos. Not going to be it's not going to be frequent. Obviously, when other cases come up, I will probably try and address it, but I don't intend to be a regular blogger or a regular YouTuber. I would like to write books, and then not, when I'm not writing books, then do other things. And if I have to come back, then I will, do some blogging and YouTube, but I would like it to sort of just stand on its own, to reach that point. But at this point where I am in my life, 2019, like I said, because I've worked so hard and for so long, I want to step away and focus on other things that aren't true crime, like travel and sport. And so, I've come through a very productive period, very prolific period, but I want to scale that down. And as I say, I know that's bad news for a lot of my fans, but I also need to sharpen the saw. I need to step away. And I think one of the reasons why Oblivion was such a good book, the 8th book, even though it wasn't extremely long, I came back from a month where I was in Europe, where I was completely sort of away from the keyboard. I didn't even have my phone connected online, through roaming, and it gave me a chance just to live a little and to just get away from the whole true crime thing. But it also meant that when I came back with so much more energy and so much more sharpness and acuity, and that's really important. It's important to sort of step away from that, and I want to encourage readers to do that as well, is to read the stuff and educate yourself in a way, but then also apply some of the things that are discussed in the books. Apply things like this idea of self-reliance, become physically fitter, get balance in your life, just as I need to do it. I think we all need to be balanced people. So in conclusion, in 2020 I hope to write half as many books as in 2019. I may start doing something new, which is pushing out a handful of Kindlets, which are books of 25,000 words or less. So I may write books that take almost less than a week to write, and they come out very, very quickly after something's happened. I thought of doing that with the Skylar case, but in the end I decided not to. I did do it with the Nora Corrin case, and it wasn't terribly successful. But that's certainly a case I want to come back to, and I want to do an episode on, and also just talk a little bit about that, because I think that's a case that's been underrepresented, and there's a lot to talk about there. The Nora Corrin case, where a little girl disappears, dies, and then no one talks about her ever again, and it's not like nothing happened there. A lot did happen. So just in terms of the authorpreneur that is mentioned in the Publishers Weekly, they talk about crime novelists who self-publish successfully need an aggressive marketing plan. They must devote a great deal of their time not just to their craft, but to building and maintaining engagement. And that's what I've been trying to do. But true crime is a difficult thing. You're not just dealing with fans, you're dealing with people who got very strong opinions, and people who want to sort of accuse people of things. You've got people who are convinced that someone is guilty, and they're adamant that they want to say someone is this or that. And what they don't realize is, I'm not sure if they don't realize it or if they do, and they are trying to sabotage my forums. But if you leave a comment somewhere, and let's just be clear when I say this. So if I say this and then you do it, then you must know what the result's going to be, but I'm going to say it. If you leave a comment where you say X is an accessory to murder, or X participated in the murder, then you need to be blocked, because if I allow that comment to stand, it means I'm endorsing your accusation. Do you understand that? So if you make a defamatory remark on social media that is administered by me, then that can be shut down. And do I want it to be shut down? No, I don't. And it seems like no matter how often you tell people this, they just don't stop. They just aren't willing to stop accusing people. And there's a reason there's a law against it. There's a reason that you don't accuse people with no evidence of something. And what I try and say when I take some of these people on is I say, I know that you feel very strongly about this. Please go to your local police station and make it official. Accuse this person, make your statement, take them to court and have them stand on trial for, I guess, murder, or whatever it is, accessory. And then please face up to a countersuit for defamation. And I will tell you now who will win. They will win. They will win. And you will pay a lot of money, right? But instead of doing that, they chatter amongst themselves. All they do is seem to leave comments everywhere saying that person was the accessory, whatever. And then they think I'm the sort of, I don't know, the monster in the story because I don't allow these comments to be made. Do you know why they're not allowed to be made? Because they're unlawful. It's illegal. It's unethical. And it's not something you would even do if you got away from your computer. In other words, if you weren't sitting in front of your computer and you were sitting opposite me right now and you wanted to type that this person's an accessory, right? And I said, do you really believe that? Yes, I do. Okay, now go to the police station and make a case and go and defend it. You wouldn't do it. And that's the cowardice and two-facedness of a lot of the people that don't understand true crime. And this is something that's true of all the high-profile cases. You don't accuse people in public of things without evidence. It's just the way it is. You can talk about aspects that are incriminating, and you can do that. And I encourage that on True Crime Rocket Science and on the blog and so on. That's how you do it. You talk about the evidence, but you don't make bold statements about someone being guilty of something. And it just beggars belief that you've got to repeatedly tell people this, and they just don't understand it. They just don't understand that you don't do it. And this makes the job of having lively and interesting discussions and having engagement, it really makes it an unpleasant process, because the number of people who just want to say X is involved in this crime, they're just huge numbers of people like that, and that's all they want to talk about. And that's not true crime rocket science, and it's not informed, and it's, as I said, it's not legal. And those people don't really belong here. But like I said, no matter how often you tell them, and when you block them, they run off to Reddit and they say that you're rude or that you don't let them express themselves. It's just not. It's not the full story. You aren't allowed to make those statements anywhere. But yeah, I mean, part of social media is the Wild West, and people are going to get away with what they can. And let's face it, a lot of these forums where people do that, where they don't refer to these people by their actual names because their content's been taken down, but they carry on with their malicious accusations. And the people who go on to all these other forums, you get a heck of a lot of traction by making these sensational, unsubstantiated claims. Everyone just comes there and says the same thing, and you get a lot of traffic, and everybody loves you, but it's wrong. It's not right. It's not certainly not. It's not how decent true crime should be. But yeah, there definitely is that sort of tabloid aspect, and certainly the tabloids do very well doing exactly the same thing, making unsubstantiated accusations constantly that take you nowhere. You constantly come up with sort of fabricated, sensational claims, and then they sort of take you to a dead end, but they get everyone's attention, and then you do it again, and you do it again, and you do it again. It's tiring and it's pointless, but it's effective. I mean, it does get people's attention. And I think in that respect, True Crime Rocket Science is quite boring. We don't do that, and we are highbrow in that sense. We don't deal with conspiracies, and we don't deal with that kind of stuff. So if you get blocked, it's not because of anything personal. It's just because I think it's a different culture. We deal with things in a grown-up way, and we do like a proper analysis, and all that other stuff that belongs somewhere else. That's sort of like the trashy tabloid version of dealing with true crime. So yeah, that's a bit of a downer. So let me try and finish this little discussion on a positive note. Part of what is fun about being interactive, not only in terms of the books but also in terms of these videos and commentaries, is that we can keep in touch. I can keep in touch with you, you can keep in touch with me, and one of the things I can offer you is freebies such as besides the free content that I'm giving you here, also, and the free blogs and so on, but also I can give you something to enjoy. I can give you a few free giveaways, a few free books, and there will be freebies when the last excerpt of the Two-Face series is posted, which is epilogue. I actually thought Oblivion would be the latest, the last book, and then there was a need for epilogue, and that then I really thought would be the last book. But when I post the excerpt for epilogue, I will also make a few freebies available. So watch that one for that. A box set is also coming. So a box set of published paperbacks of all 9 books. We might do a Silver Fox box set later on, but for now there'll be a Two-Face box set. I might do that in the lead up to Christmas. And then, yes, when Silver Fox comes out, we might do some giveaways with that. In time, I wouldn't mind giving away the odd Kindle as well. If I become less obscure, and if the books continue selling, and certainly if they sell even more, then I'd be happy to give a little bit back as well, and to give away the odd Kindles. There is a large crowd out there that are into the traditional medium, and I'm trying to convert you guys. I realize that, I myself, I prefer reading written books, but my books aren't written like the traditional books. They've got literally hundreds of links in them, hundreds of links to blogs, to video, to interviews, to the specific moment certain things are said, and that makes them a very rich resource. So you should really try the whole Kindle thing. You don't need a Kindle to read a book on Kindle. You just download the free app. You do need an Amazon account, but for more information on that, please refer to the link in the description. It'll take you to a blog post, why are your books only available on Kindle and how do I get one, and that'll just sort of explain it. It's an explainer, and then there are also links that you can follow. It's actually quite simple. You can, if you don't have the Kindle device, you can simply download the free app onto your computer or onto your phone, and then you simply just buy the Amazon Kindle book, and then you read it on the app. It's as simple as that. But a lot of people like reading it on Kindles. It's the interface is just in a way that the script looks very much like paper, and even when you change pages, it sounds like paper when you turn the page. There's so many advantages to Kindle. I mean, you can search for certain things that you want to read about. You probably the best aspect is that you can get the book immediately when you want it. So literally, if you see that the book's available, you can get it within minutes. Whereas any other option, any other paperback option is going to take you at least one day, and often a few days, right? And then I guess the other aspect is if you're traveling, if you're on an aeroplane or whatever, you don't need to sort of carry a book around with you. You can have it on your phone. You can have it on a iPad or laptop that you're carrying with you anyway. So that's what makes it sort of pretty useful. So yeah, thank you for listening. And watch this space for more news of Silver Fox. As I said, will be available later in October.